Hi, everyone. So your professor, Jason, has asked me to give a little guest lecture on applied prejudice reduction and applied social psychology. I am right now in the middle of teaching this huge undergraduate course, and I would say no to anyone but Jason, anyone at all. And that is because Jason was my first PhD student. So I knew him back when he was young and a little baby. And I thought I would start by showing you a photo of him back when he was my student. Okay, so am I great at technology stuff? No, I'm not, but let's see what I can do. Okay, so here we are. Oh no. Here we are. This is a picture of me and Jason and some of his PhD brothers and sisters, probably, I don't know, 10 years ago now. So Jason was my first PhD student. Together we investigated all manner of things and formed, I think, a close friendship and an ongoing collaborative relationship. And as a consequence, I am putting down my teaching hat for a second here and putting on my UK teaching hat. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing the screen now if I can work out how to do this. Maybe I can't. Hey, here we are. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about marriage equality and prejudice towards gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer, questioning, transgender, intersex and asexual people, and people whose sexuality or sexual orientation isn't strictly heterosexual. I'm going to talk specifically about the case of marriage equality or equal marriage. So marriage was exclusively between one man and one woman in Australia up until 3 years ago, till 2017. And before then, gay relationships were, not recognised through marriage equality. In fact, gay male sexual relationships were actually criminalised in Tasmania up until 1995, something we'll get into later. So why would anyone in social psychology have a role to play in what seems to be at first glance a political issue? The answer to this is because there's a tremendous body of scientific work that shows that discrimination has a huge impact on gay and lesbian people in particular. So one area that I started getting interested in that Jason's probably talked to you about is work on minority stress. So in the 90s, this guy called Meyer started to investigate what he called minority stress in gay men in New York, I believe. Basically, he made the case that facing discrimination and constantly facing prejudice had the potential to act as a stressor that could lead to mental ill health and lack of mental well-being. So he opened his paper with a quote. A young man saying, this young man, the 16-year-old Bobby Griffith, wrote, I can't let anyone find out I'm not straight. It would just be so humiliating. My friends would hate me. I just know it. They might even want to beat me up. I guess I'm no good to anyone, not even God. Life is so cruel and unfair. Sometimes I just feel like disappearing off the face of this earth. That description to me, it still feels emotionally raw. It feels really heartbreaking. But I guess something that is potentially more heartbreaking is the fact that this is a common story and a common narrative for kids and young adults and even older adults growing up gay in previous years. Basically, and again, it's not really rocket science, but it was a novel idea at the time, repeatedly being told, you're no good, there's fundamentally something wrong with you because you're gay, can have a lasting negative effect on how you feel about yourself, whether you feel that you're someone capable of living a happy life, whether you experience depression or stress, and so on. So basically, and I'm sure all these emails are popping up on my screen as well and being recorded. Basically, the idea is that experiencing prejudice acts as a stressor, which encourages mental ill health. Since the publication of this paper, many hundreds of studies have confirmed this fact. People who face discrimination are more likely to report and experience depression and anxiety. People who face discrimination are also more likely to say that they cope with the stress by using often maladaptive coping mechanisms, such as using drugs, smoking cigarettes, drinking alcohol to excess, etc. The work on minority stress has really been broadened from its initial focus. Research now shows that members of any groups that are historically devalued or stigmatized who face prejudice tend to report ill health. One interesting thing is that this goes beyond mental health through to physical health. So work from Australia, for example, shows that Aboriginal or Indigenous Australians who face more prejudice are more likely to give birth to low underweight infants. Work also from meta-analyses comprehensively shows that people who face more discrimination are more likely to report negative cardiovascular health. Again, this really makes sense. You're talking about chronic stress and chronic pressure, which can lead to wear and tear and problems with your cardiovascular function, reactivity, etc. So prejudice, minority stress is a problem. And in the case of gay and lesbian people in particular, it's also really a problem. The thing about prejudice is that, of course, it can be what we often read about or what we might see as an example in a TV show. Really overt homophobia, for example, hate crimes, using homophobic slurs, all this sort of stuff. But what we know about prejudice and discrimination is that it can be interpersonal like that, but it can also be very much institutionalized and written into our laws and embodied in our practices at universities, at schools, in parliament. Basically, prejudice can be in our systems. When I started thinking about marriage equality, it seemed to me very much the case that all fair and well if you're lucky enough to be a little gay kid that has the acceptance of your parents and your friends, but there's still a pretty powerful message you're getting from the country that your love is not equal, that your love is not enough. And so I really started to think about marriage equality and lack of marriage equality as a minority stressor, something that damages the health and well-being, also the legal safety and so on and so forth of queer communities. When I really started getting, into this in depth was probably about 10 or so years ago, 10 or 15 years ago. And in this time, marriage between two men or two women had been legalized sporadically in certain states in the US, and then overturned, etc. And there were some Scandinavian nations where it had been legalized. So I was really interested to turn to the literature looking at how equal marriage might be affecting gay and lesbian and people of diverse sexual orientations. The literature here was also remarkably clear. That is, there seemed to be an immediate relief to marriage equality for queer people. So work out of the States pardon me, work out of the States revealed that gay and lesbian people living in states where marriage equality was legalized saw an immediate sharp drop in their mental health symptoms after the legalization of marriage equality. There's also tons of cool work out of Scandinavia looking at how gay and lesbian couples felt about marriage equality, how they felt after they could get legally married. They described it as having a knock-on effect, such that getting married was important to them psychologically, but it also seemed to lead to more family support. Or another way of thinking that is fewer minority stresses. The kids of same-sex couples also reported feeling happier once their parents could get married, feeling an increased sense of security, and again, just an increased societal recognition of the validity of their relationships. Okay, so here I am 10 years ago, and I'm super interested in all of this, and I think it's very important as a social psychologist looking at discrimination, and a psychologist broadly who is interested in the mental health of populations. At around this time, I was talking with a lot of my colleagues about this, and one of my colleagues, Sharon Dane, an incredible lesbian activist as well as researcher, approached me on behalf of an organisation called Australian Marriage Equality. So I'm going to horrifically attempt to share screen again. Let's see how it goes. No, I have no idea what I just shared there. All right, give me one more chance. Okay, so I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to swap the display settings, and here we are. Okay, so I got approached by Sharon Dane on behalf of a group called Australian Marriage Equality. Now, Australian Marriage Equality was founded by this man in the middle here, Rodney Croome, and this is him getting arrested in 1988 at a stall for gay rights reform. Rodney is simply an incredible man, an incredible activist. Rodney was instrumental in overturning the law in Tasmania that I told you about, where gay male sexual relationships were criminalised up until 1995. He marched into a police station in his native Tasmania and said, well, I'm here and I'm gay, arrest me, and if you don't, I'm not leaving. And this really sparked, so basically he sat in that police station. This really sparked a huge conversation and eventual reform of the law. Yeah. Rodney has been a tireless advocate for sexual minorities broadly, and in particular for marriage equality. Rodney believed and believes that equal status under the law is just critically important for gay and lesbian people. And he believes this from a lived experience perspective. He knows what it's like to face discrimination on the basis of his sexuality. Okay, so here he is, it's 1988, and he has been, at this point, let's say, fighting for rights for gay people for, what is it? So if we're in 2010 in my story, then 22 years, just out, on no money, etc., out of the goodness of his heart. So there's Rodney when I met him. Basically, Australian Marriage Equality said, really, we're continuing to talk to people about marriage equality, and we want to get some information about what psychology says about the effect of marriage on gay and lesbian people and the effect of denying marriage to gay and lesbian people. And at this point, he asked me if I would like to come along and actually try and act as a science communicator and fly to Canberra, where Parliament House is, and meet MPs, members of Parliament, and senators and politicians, basically, and put forward the scientific research on marriage equality to see if that might change their mind. Now, at the time, we have widespread opposition to marriage equality among parliamentarians. We do not have the numbers required to pass marriage equality. That is just a fact. So the goal coming there for Rodney is very much to talk to politicians and change their hearts and minds. And the goal for me, of course, is to present the psychological research. The science, I think, has an extremely important role here because we need to back up stories with data. So again, I'm going to turn to the scientific literature for this. I was recently reading a meta-analysis on persuasion. What do people find persuasive? And people find personal narratives persuasive, right? So if I tell you about something that happened in my life, it can really put a vivid image in your head and convince you that, hey, something needs to change or whatever it is. However, the meta-analysis that I was looking at compared the persuasive impact of narratives to the persuasive impact of statistics, data. By and large, and overwhelmingly, they found that statistics were more persuasive, more convincing. People seem to really respond to statistical information. Now, this really resonates with me because I respond very heavily to statistical information. You know, if I'm going to do something, I really want to know that, hey, this is sound, this is supported by the literature, this appears to be the right thing to do, given what we know. And like all of you, I live in my own head, right? So there's a phenomenon by which, as humans, the best insight we have into human nature is ourselves, basically. We think our own thoughts and we can observe our own behavior and thoughts. And so often we tend to generalize what we think to other people. So we tend to assume that other people think and feel the same way we do. So remember, I'm here and I've got this information that statistics are very convincing. I personally am hugely convinced by statistics. So I feel happily armed with statistics to go and talk to these parliamentarians. My honest feeling at this stage is that maybe they just don't know. Maybe they just don't know the statistics. They don't realize that institutionalized discrimination is doing harm to people. And if they would realize it, then they would stop it because it's not supported by the data. So I get together with a group of people that are part of this sort of Australian marriage equality conglomeration. I'm hoping you're seeing my screen at the moment. And we fly to Canberra, this is in 2012 at this point, to go and talk to parliamentarians. So I'm part of a diverse group. We have medical doctors, my dear colleague Sharon Dane there, medical doctors. We also have a suite of religious leaders, so pastors and priests, etc., who are making the religious case for marriage equality. And then Sharon and I here, who want to summarise the psychological case for marriage equality. And this is us chilling in the waiting room. There's a lot of waiting at Parliament House to actually have time to go and see different parliamentarians, etc. So we get up and basically it's, you know, I mean, you probably can imagine what Parliament House is. It's like just a massive suite of offices of parliamentarians, and we are booked in back to back to talk to people about marriage equality and present the information. So I was excited. I was really excited because I'm like, okay, they have this gap in their knowledge about statistics, and I'll correct them by putting the knowledge about statistics with them, and we'll be fine. What actually happened, however, was very different. I had ignored the fact that, of course, people also have really different moral intuitions that are relatively resilient to statistical information, and I needed to take that into account. So what did we do? For several days, we basically visited different people with political sway and political power in Australia to present the facts to them. So our meetings would go like this. Rodney perhaps would start the conversation. Rodney, of course, knowing every single parliamentarian by name at this stage because he has been working tirelessly as an activist in Canberra for many years at this point. He might start the conversation, and then the medical doctors, for example, might start talking about the ambiguities around biological sex and why limiting marriage to just one man and one woman doesn't even really make sense when you consider intersex people and gender diverse people, etc. We might then have the religious leaders, pastors and priests, etc., make the case for marriage equality and talk about why they think biblically marriage equality is appropriate and how they think it's good for their communities and their parishioners, etc. And then you've got me and Sharon who are talking about what we feel are very clear links between experiences of discrimination and suicidality, very serious things, as well as the evidence coming out of the States and Scandinavia showing that actually there's a solution right at our fingertips. Legalizing marriage equality is going to be good for young LGBTI plus kids. And young adults and older adults, pretty much everyone. It's a win-win as far as we can tell. So we visited, I don't know, 50 different parliamentarians in this setting. And during that time, I think we changed 0 hearts and minds. And this was a first useful lesson for me when it comes to science communication. And that is, don't expect immediate results. In fact, many of the people who we talked to would go on to change their opinion and go on to vote in favour of marriage equality, but it was a long journey. We had to not get downhearted, and again, I had to remind myself almost of a moral obligation to just basically explain the literature as I understood it and leave the rest with them. So what happened? Well, remember I said it's really important to take the long-term perspective. I want us to cut to 5 years later. We've still been sharing this research and advocating this entire time, and nothing has happened. Sharon and I have had many discussions in which we've talked about the importance of sharing the research and also recognized that in fact, this may never be a change that we'll see in our lifetime. But in 2017, things started to really hot up. Incredible activists had put a lot more political pressure on people to change the law and to recognise equal marriage, basically. And at this point, I'm not going to get into all the details, but there was a big back and forth, and it was decided that this would be put to a nationwide plebiscite or vote, basically, that the Australian public would determine whether or not marriage equality could be legalised. Now, this solution was really put forward by a government who felt pretty convinced that the Australian public would vote against marriage equality. And indeed, I think there was a lot of uncertainty in everyone's minds. So remember, back in 2012, my responsibility was to try and share the information with people who were in the position of making a decision on marriage equality. Of course, the same is true in 2017, but who's making the decision fundamentally changes. So in this case, it now becomes members of the general public. And we've got to brainstorm to work out how we can reach the general public in the face of huge misinformation campaigns and scare tactics. So what do we do? Well, one thing that I did, I love that photo, is try and prepare some of the facts about marriage equality into an infographic that could be easily shareable in people's social media and so on and so forth. Basically, summing up the literature that I've described to you, right? How are kids doing of same-sex parents? What do we know about the effect of discrimination on suicidality, depression and anxiety, and unsafe behaviour? What do we know about the effect of marriage on families? And so this is something that I prepared, again, to try and get out to as many people as possible so that they would be armed with this knowledge when making their own decision. Of course, other people were doing a whole bunch of incredible things. So at my university, and Jace was here at this time, I think, people were making videos to talk about the personal impact of lack of marriage equality on them. So I'm just going to share a little video that one of my honours students made during that period.
Absolutely love being an elite athlete. Having the opportunity to work together with an amazing group of women to achieve a common goal, it's fantastic. And also a huge part of my role is to mentor young up-and-coming netballers to help them manage their sport and study. Being able to play netball competitively as my job is just absolutely a dream come true. I love it, and to be able to turn up every day and just be with my best friends who are also my teammates there's nothing better. The advice I'd give to aspiring young athletes is to pursue it as a passion. The moment it becomes work, that's when you cut it. Just keep asking for help and keep playing for the love of the game. I guess my hopes and dreams for the future after my netball career is done is that I'd love to be a practicing organisational psych. I'd really like to move back to Toowoomba to be close to family. And I guess I'd really like to meet someone, meet the right girl, and one day get married and start a family. But the future that I hope for can only be a possibility if you vote yes and if you return your response to the Australian Postal Survey. My future is in your hands.
So you've got to remember that, you know, on the one hand, this advocacy seems, I think, pretty political. And on the other hand, it's advocacy that is supported in this case by the School of Psychology because it's very strongly on the basis of promoting community health and promoting human health and well-being. So in 2017, a marriage equality finally went to vote. And we were all, as you can imagine, watching the votes roll in together. We who had, you know, been working pretty hard to try and get the science across to the public. I vividly remember it when the numbers started jumping up on screen and it was shown that in fact Australia had voted in favour of equal marriage by a big margin. I was incredibly pleased. And then I looked over and I saw Sharon just hugging and kissing her wife, who she'd married in the UK previously, but of course it hadn't been recognised in Australia until then. It was like I was watching years of pressure lift off her shoulders and relief wash over her. And it was an incredibly moving moment. Because often in this field, science isn't just science, it also becomes personal when you see human suffering or human health as a result of it. My dog's moving around in the background. So where to from here? Does that mean that we're done? No. Certainly we know that legal rights can be taken away just as they can be afforded, and that sexual prejudice is unfortunately still a reality in many people's lives. I've also used the terms gay and lesbian quite a lot. My apologies. I've also used the terms gay and lesbian quite a lot in this discussion, and that perhaps reflects the terms used in the marriage equality debate, which was very much on people who identified as gay and people who identified as lesbian. The reality when it comes to sexual orientation diversity and gender diversity is much more complex with that. And in particular, the rights and legal protections and effects of discrimination against transgender and gender diverse people really often weren't touched on in the debate for marriage equality. This year, with my incoming PhD student, we started to really look at the effects of discrimination on transgender and gender diverse people more broadly. And my student has just finished her first study. What did she find? Well, probably not going to come as a huge surprise. Basically, she was looking at factors that really predicted health and well-being in transgender and gender diverse populations who are, we know from the literature, at risk of mental ill health and suicidality, likely for the reasons discussed concerning minority stress. First of all, she found, as might be expected, that hormone treatments and gender-affirming surgeries were linked to better health and well-being and more life satisfaction in transgender and gender diverse people. What she didn't expect, however, was the incredibly large role support from the cisgender community played. Whether or not transgender people had support from the cisgender community, so this might include cisgender, so that's people who identify with the gender that they were assigned at birth or their biological sex. Support from the cisgender community accounted for about 25% of the variance in depressive symptoms. It was a huge predictor. Let me put it another way. It was the case in our data that when transgender people feel that they are not supported by the cisgender community, that they do not have support, they are dramatically more likely to experience depressive and anxiety symptoms that in many cases are clinical. I think in light of many things that have been going on recently, this data is incredibly relevant. It tells us that there's more to do when it comes to challenging prejudice and discrimination against people with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities, and that science has a crucial role to play in understanding and even creating social change. Thank you.